Imagine a time when chastity belts were locked with iron keys. Doctors diagnosed women with hysteria for being too emotional, and monks wrote entire manuals on how to sin properly. In the medieval world, sexuality wasn't just taboo. It was dangerous, twisted, and often terrifying. Behind the grand castles and stained glass cathedrals lay secrets far stranger than fiction tales of religious guilt, public punishments, and erotic rituals that defy belief. This is not your high school history class. This is the dark, bizarre, and shockingly real world of medieval sexual practices. The tyranny of the church in the bedroom. In medieval Europe, the church had more control over sex than most kings had over their own kingdoms. It dictated when you could have sex, never on Sundays, saints' days, or during Lent, which was roughly half the year. Sex was only permitted for procreation. Pleasure? That was the devil's work. Monks and priests wrote guides called penitentials, listing detailed sexual sins and their punishments. Kissing a woman passionately, 2 weeks of fasting, having sex standing up, that was unnatural and sinful. Married couples were expected to abstain during pregnancy, menstruation, and oddly during the woman's lactation period. Some couples spent more time sinning than confessing. Indoor chastity belts, reality or myth. The idea of a metal chastity belt locked tight to preserve a woman's purity while her husband rode off to war is one of the most famous images of medieval sexuality. But were they real? Historians now argue that most chastity belts were symbolic or exaggerated later in the Renaissance. The few that exist are likely 16th century joke pieces or even Victorian-era hoaxes. But the idea itself reflects a disturbing truth. Women's sexuality was so feared that it had to be locked away, literally. Trial by virginity, purity tests, and divine justice. Medieval justice was often cruel. A woman accused of adultery or impurity might be forced to undergo a trial by ordeal, walking on hot coals, holding red-hot iron, or being thrown into a river. If she survived, God had declared her innocent. If not, well, divine will had spoken. Virginity was also a legal matter. Brides were sometimes inspected before or after marriage, and in royal circles, bed sheets stained with blood from the wedding night were displayed as proof of purity. The absence of blood could result in annulment, scandal, or worse. The sinful art of intercourse manuals. Despite the strict church rules, medieval people were curious and creative. By the 13th and 14th centuries, illustrated manuscripts began to circulate, showing detailed sexual positions. Some were educational, others were pornographic. One of the most infamous was the Secretum Secretorum, a text allegedly written for Alexander the Great containing sexual advice, including when to avoid intercourse, like under a full moon, and which foods could boost libido. Then came the Kama Sutra-inspired Latin adaptations in Moorish Spain, blending Islamic eroticism with European intrigue. These weren't widely accepted, they were smuggled, hidden, whispered about in elite circles. Public punishment for private acts, homosexuality, adultery, and masturbation were all punishable crimes. In many cities, convicted men accused of sodomy were publicly paraded naked, whipped, or burned alive. Women found guilty of adultery could have their heads shaved or be forced to ride through town backwards on a donkey while holding pig intestines, a spectacle designed to humiliate. But it wasn't just about punishment. These events served as public entertainment, turning human sexuality into public theater of shame. The cult of relics and erotic saints. Sexuality and sainthood were often linked in strange ways. Some saints like Saint Agnes were praised for their virginity, refusing marriage and dying rather than surrendering their purity. Others, like Mary Magdalene, were framed as fallen women turned holy, reinforcing the idea that female sexuality must be repented, not celebrated. And relics? Even weirder. Certain monasteries claim to have preserved body parts of saints, including breasts, hair, and even virginal blood. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles to venerate these sexualized objects. One church even claimed to possess the foreskin of Jesus. Yes, seriously. Witchcraft, sex, and Satan. By the late medieval period, the fear of female sexuality evolved into something darker: witch hunts. Women were accused of sleeping with demons, performing orgies in the woods, and using their sexuality to steal men's potency. Inquisitors asked bizarre questions. Did the devil have a penis? Did it burn? Did he finish? Confessions mostly extracted through torture revealed absurd sexual fantasies. Some women were said to have grown a second nipple to suckle demons. Others were forced to describe how Satan entered them during black masses. The real reason? Fear. Fear of female power, independence, and above all, desire. Monastic hypocrisy and hidden lust. Celibacy was the law for monks and nuns, but behind closed monastery doors, rules were bent. Letters from nuns in the 12th century detail forbidden love affairs. Some monks secretly kept mistresses, others fathered children, leading to quiet bribes and cover-ups. There are even accounts of double monasteries where men and women lived in separate quarters, but conveniently met during shared religious observances. The church often turned a blind eye as long as no scandal spilled into public view. Medical madness, diagnosing female desire. Women who expressed sexual desire were often diagnosed with hysteria, believed to be caused by a wandering womb. Treatments ranged from prayer and fasting to horrifying mechanical devices meant to massage away the excess desire. In some regions, doctors recommended early marriage or pregnancy as a cure. In others, midwives secretly treated women with herbal tinctures and massages, sometimes crossing over into erotic relief. These women walked the fine line between healer and heretic. Animal trials and sexual deviance. One of the most bizarre and real aspects of medieval justice involved putting animals on trial. If a man was accused of bestiality, both he and the animal could be publicly executed. In France, pigs were hanged, horses decapitated, and goats burned at the stake wearing tiny clothes to preserve modesty. These weren't isolated cases. Legal records confirmed dozens of such trials. The medieval mind saw sex not just as a moral issue, but as a cosmic disruption that had to be punished, human or not. The surprising role of brothels. In many cities, prostitution wasn't outlawed, it was regulated. Medieval brothels, especially in places like Paris and London, were licensed and taxed. Some were even run by the city itself. Prostitutes wore color-coded dresses, were inspected for diseases, and paid protection fees. But behind the regulation was exploitation. Women were often sold into sex work, trafficked from rural areas, or forced into it after being widowed or orphaned. Brothels were tolerated sins, necessary evils in a world obsessed with suppressing desire. Forbidden books and erotic poetry. Despite the church's control, erotic literature flourished underground. Troubadours sang lustful songs, often mocking noble women or clerics. Some poems even described same-sex love, incest, or secret liaisons with angels. One 14th century French poem describes a knight who falls in love with a statue, only to find it magically brought to life purely by his passion. Another tells of a nun who weds Christ in an erotic dream that toes the line between divine ecstasy and physical orgasm. The medieval world was obsessed with sex and terrified of it. What makes it bizarre isn't just the acts themselves, but the contradictions. A church that preached purity but funded brothels. A society that punished desire but secretly worshipped it in whispers and art. We often think of the past as simpler, purer, more innocent. But history shows otherwise. Behind the tapestries and sermons were people messy, curious, fearful, and deeply human. If this glimpse into the strangest corners of medieval sexuality shocked or intrigued you, there's more where that came from. Subscribe to the channel for more hidden truths, forbidden stories, and the uncomfortable facts your textbooks left out. History is dark, strange, and never boring,